this presentation's changed 3 times in the last 3 days, and my group, I said I would tell one story. I'm going to tell two stories, actually. One is going to be about sea level rise, and one is going to be about water utility assessment. The sea level rise story, so at 5 minutes, Dan, that's when I should be moving on to the second one. Yeah, awesome, thank you. So the sea level rise story for us sort of started when Mayor Ed Lee in 2013 said 2 things. One, I want us to deal with sea level rise in the context of capital planning in San Francisco. 2, I don't want a big climate action plan adaptation story. We have a climate action plan, but it's focused on mitigation in San Francisco. It's been around for a decade. But he said, I don't want a big climate adaptation plan for all of San Francisco. I want you to focus in on this sea level rise issue and as it affects our capital planning in particular across all the city departments. So we have a 10-year capital plan. It's a roll-up of PUC, San Francisco Airport, the port, and all the other agencies that have capital investment, whether it's R&R or new capital, big expensive capital. And every 2 years, we do a new 10-year plan, so it rolls forward. And Ed Lee said, I want to understand the impact of sea level rise on these plans so that we're resilient to climate change as we move these plans forward. Having worked with all of you for a long time, I knew 2 things. 1, start with the science, and 2, don't take other people's word for the science. Look at it yourself closely, carefully, and with an eye toward the uncertainties and all of that. And so, I was chairing the committee that was developing the guidance. I skipped that part, but there's a committee that's doing this, and I was chairing the committee. And the state of California had guidance at the time that we started this, and don't get mad, Ryan, but I didn't want to use those numbers automatically. I wanted to, is this too loud? Am I being super loud? No, okay. I didn't want to use them automatically for a lot of reasons, one of which was a history of exaggeration, perhaps, when it came to the Ramsdorff data, the semi-empirical method that was dominant in California, at least in terms of sea level rise science for a number of years, was adopted by the Schwarzenegger administration, and I thought had been used in a rather catastrophizing kind of way. So long story short, Ramsdorff said 21 to 55 inches in 2100, and the state of California gradually over time from document to document ended up shortening that to 55 inches straight across. It started as up to 55 and ended up 55. I'm really digressing now. That was the reason why I didn't want to just take the state guidance that was in place in 2010, when we got this thing started before the 2013 update. So we did a deep dive into the science to start with. And backing up, that deep dive was not aided by a climate service enterprise that existed in the Bay Area, because there is no climate service enterprise that exists in the Bay Area that I know of. And that I knew of then, that I know of now, or that I knew of then. The RESA program, as some of you know, I don't think Caitlin will be surprised to hear me say this, is not visible in Northern California. They're visible in Southern California. So we didn't have that to lean on. So what I did was create my own climate service by calling people that I knew because of meetings like this, being the pet stakeholder in all these science meetings that I've been for 5 or 6 years. I knew Tad Pfeffer, I knew Phil Mote, I knew Dan Cahan, I knew Anders Leverman, and those are the people that I leaned on to say, why does AR5 say 39 inches is the peak number for sea level rise, while NRC says it's 66 inches, while NCA in the form of Paris et al., because it was still draft at the time, said 78 inches. To me, this was confounding and confusing. And so we had to do a deep dive into gaining an understanding that I'm sure many of you already have or have had for years, as to the different approaches that IPCC has and how NRC did their numbers and what Adam was talking about when he had the 4 scenarios with the 2 meters at the upper end. And in the end, we were able to settle on the same report that the state adopted as best available science, which was the NRC report on Oregon, Washington, and California. But we added a wrinkle to it, which was in the report, which is not just look at the lower end of the range, but the upper end of the range, but look at the middle of the range as well, which was embedded in that report, though hidden. That report, just from a climate, service and decision maker perspective, very, very important, utterly unintelligible. Okay? Decision makers cannot read the NRC report and get anything out of it. I read it, I saw a table. You can't go into the details of how they worked with the projections. It's called the committee recommendation now. It's crazy what they ended up doing, but extremely useful when you got it translated, and that's what I did. Tad and Phil, in particular, translated that report for me in a way that I could use so that I could settle on a 3-foot sea level rise number by the end of the century as the most likely sea level rise level that we needed to plan for, and a 66-inch at the upper end of the level, which was in the NRC report. So we didn't dismiss uncertainty. We didn't seek a single number. What we sought was an understanding of the science across the board and a way to deal with that uncertainty, which we ended up suggesting in this document, which is what ended the process, Guidance for Incorporating Sea Level Rise into Capital Planning in San Francisco, an approach to adaptive capacity that told people how to deal with the uncertainty, meaning engineers and planners how to deal with the uncertainty and the difference between 36 and 66 inches, which is substantial. I would argue hundreds of millions, if not multi-billions of dollars in difference. And so my lessons are twofold in that area. One, it can be done when you start with ignorance, as we did, and you have a service that's provided to you and people who want to help you, you can get to the end game of planning, which is where we are now. This is in the second cycle of its implementation in the 10-year capital plan. And secondly, the Bay Area has a problem. There's no climate service there. And as 120 agencies with land management jurisdiction along San Francisco Bay now struggle with these exact same issues, and they all are doing it. I blew the time thing, but they all are doing that. Where are they turning? And the answer is they're turning to all kinds of different places in a probably, I would not say probably, but in an uncoordinated way. Missy's nodding because I was about to say muddled and confusing. That is which is the term you use. That is sort of what goes on a little bit in the planning in the Bay Area right now. Number 2 is the Pilot Utility Modeling Applications Project of the Water Utility Climate Alliance. 4 water utilities, Seattle, Portland, New York, and Tampa Bay, went deep into a co-production environment over a period of years with selected climate science consortiums, usually REISs, but not only the REISs, to look at their vulnerability of their water supply. And they all did different things. Julie mentioned the bake-off that Portland did for a hydrologic model with UW. In that process, they ended up finding an internal tool that they can use to use any kind of climate information they want in the future to evaluate their vulnerability. In Tampa, they actually invented a downscaling technique, and they used some regional climate models before rejecting them as entirely much too computer intensive in looking at the rainfall issue it's actually spatial and temporal distribution rainfall in Florida that matters most to them, et cetera, et cetera. Capacity building, co-production in practice, developing tools, figuring out how to use models in logical ways was what happened. And the 2 lessons from that are, 1, on the positive side, co-production does work when you have people on both sides of the coin who want to do it. And by the way, I believe every Puma project shelled out some of their own money, not a ton, but some of their own money for this. And on the negative side, in terms of lessons, none of the information any of them gathered that I've heard lately, the Portland hydro model being an exception, is actionable. New York found they needed information on extremes that was of higher quality than they could get, even when they invented their own little downscaling disaggregation technique. Tampa didn't think that the downscaling tool that they invented, although it worked better than BCSD, which they had tried out, combined with the regional climate models database that was too time consuming to use, not database, but the models themselves. And at bottom, there was a missing sense of actionability. So I think the lesson there for us is, okay, science can be brought to the table, but if it doesn't help us produce decision-making, what is going to happen? And there I want to come back again to Sarowitz, who said we need more science driven by societal needs. I'm not saying that because I naively assume that if we just throw more money into GCMs and downscaling tools, that we're going to get climate information that's going to create certainty for us at all. I'm just wondering whether if Sarowitz is right that we need more societally driven science from USGCRP or other places that try to answer these questions. Will we make more progress than we've been able to make in advance of the Puma project, which did not produce actionable information for the most part for utilities, though it would be an exaggeration to say they didn't learn a lot. They did learn a lot. Okay, I'll stop. Thanks. On the button?
I'm just curious about the discovery that these co-production efforts yielded non-actionable science. Is there any of that could have been anticipated before all of this intensive work? In other words, if you hadn't started with the science, but started more with the decision-making environment, would any of that have been avoided, or was that just learning that occurred?
No, they did start with the decision-making environment. For New York, it was they're more concerned about turbidity than they are water supply. So they were starting with the idea: what can we extract from GCMs and their downstream cousins in regards to extreme events? Because they're concerned about turbidity more than water supply, and they have water quality models and all of that. I think, Tampa, I don't want to exaggerate. They're not concerned right now. They don't need to take action right now. I don't think they thought either of the tools were ready for prime time, but they knew what they were evaluating from the beginning too, because Tampa doesn't have any surface storage. They are moving to the surface in terms of their supplies from the groundwater, the opposite of what is supposed to be happening in the West because of the sensitivity of groundwater in the Everglades and in Florida. So they knew they had freshwater flow sensitivity in the surface along with no storage, and so it's very ephemeral, the water supply. So they needed to know about the spatial and temporal distribution of precip. So it's not, I don't think that they didn't start with asking the right questions, just like Ed Lee asked us the right question about sea level rise and capital planning. It's that they got to the end of the exercise, and I guess maybe they learned a few different things, but included among them was, okay, the science is not necessarily where we need to go for decision making today. John.
So back to your San Francisco example, you said that you were frustrated that there was no climate services organization availability to run to deal with sea level rise. You're part of the Bay Area, and there are, I think, 9 counties that touch the Bay. Do those counties not talk to each other? Does BCDC not provide guidance on how they should all think about sea level rise?
Yeah, right now the politics of sea level rise in the Bay Area is everybody's doing their own thing. Some are more ahead than others. Before me came the ART project in the East Bay that BCDC ran. And after me came a consultant-driven project that San Mateo County is doing with Arcadis and a bunch of veterans from the Coastal Conservancy who are doing a great job. But at the same time, those 120 agencies don't have an organizing forum for themselves. And BCDC is not yet it. They're making moves toward doing that. We tried to start one called Charge, and it just fell apart for reasons that are much too weird to get into here, but there is no thing like that, and we're starting to talk to each other more and more, but there's no forum for that I know of. That doesn't mean there isn't one, but that I know of today. There needs to be one, and so we need to step up on that, and BCDC is kind of positioning themselves to be that. Their advantage is they're really good on the science, and they are astride the entire community. The bad news is that they're a regulator at the same time, and so it's hard for regulators to be conveners.
Let me interject really quickly. So I see Susie, John, and Adam have questions. We got Behar on the stand here at this point, so should we invite the rest of the panelists up, or is he still on point here with Kaiju? Yeah, sure.
Specific to him.
Further questions? Yeah.
What's BCDC?
San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission.
So just a
They were founded to keep the bay from getting smaller through infill, and now their job is to keep the bay from getting bigger because of sea level rise. That's one way they're looking at it, and they have an infill strategy group that's trying to figure out how to allow the things that they were born to stop.
Susie has the microphone.
Okay, so just a couple of clarification questions. One on the Bay Area climate service idea. I wonder if you could dream up your ideal climate service organization. It seems to me we keep using that word, but we are actually not articulating what would it look like. What is that thing that we want? Because some of us would argue we do have that. We might not have it at the greatest quality. There might be improvements, but I'm hearing in you saying there isn't anything for you that you wanted close to home, personal touch, whatever. I don't know. I'm putting words
I can
in your
do
mouth.
it, yep.
So
How
anyway,
much time we got?
I want to hear that. And the second one is, what is the problem with actionable information? Why did it not, why was it not actionable? Was it because the science is simply not there, the variables that were produced were the wrong ones, or you didn't have confidence in using any of that? I want to get a finer spin on that.
Well, each project in Puma was different. I think we have actionable information when it comes to sea level rise, and sea level rise sometimes is of a different nature than T&P type dependent stuff. We care about ET and runoff, and that's what leads to water supply, and that's harder for the climate science community to articulate than evapotranspiration. Sorry, ET is the major source. I mean, that's where most of the water that falls from the sky goes, and so as it gets warmer, we get less of it in our rivers, and our rivers lead to our reservoirs, and our reservoirs lead to our taps. So that's where it. So why? Okay, so every project was different. So in Portland, they found that the LIVNA database was wrong for Bull Run watershed. This is the what do they call the historical not bias corrected, the historical database that is about, you grid it. Maurer has one, reanalysis. The reanalysis data set that everybody's using up there is LIVNA, and it was wrong for Bull Run, which is what they cared about, so they had to correct it. That doesn't answer your question, though, because once they fixed it, they got toward actionability. Though, I think an argument could be, would someone other than Portland, with their relative sophistication, with the UW people, with their tons of sophistication, have figured that out or not? In New York, it's the standard. The tails of the distribution are most poorly understood. They did a bin method where they divided the PDF into 4%, so 25 bins, and they compared the most extreme bins, which are the biggest storms that they're most concerned about because of turbidity, to the most extreme bins in the historical data set. But they did. It was a CMIP3 database, and it was not enough GCMs, and I think they didn't have confidence in the ability of the downscaling technique to disaggregate precipitation, like everybody does. And Tampa, I said I didn't want to exaggerate. I just thought, they found BCSD and a couple of other statistical tools that they used were lousy at the thing they cared about, which is mostly spatial distribution of precipitation. They invented their own technique. It worked better. But they think the RCMs are a lot of higher quality in terms of information, yet they don't have the ability to run them, even though the Southeast RISA and University of Florida did run some RCMs for them. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but.
I think you get to call yourself a pet stakeholder with all those acronyms.
Well, I've been indoctrinated by all of you all over the years, but the answer to the first question is yes, I can articulate it, and I think we should do that.
Well, I think everything you did, all of your instincts and everything you did to create climate services for around the specific issue on sea level rise was really spot on, and your instincts were great. But I have a slightly different take that climate services wasn't what got to actionable. And maybe it's not different, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but really, if the mayor hadn't started the whole story with saying, I want something for our capital improvement plan, I don't think it would have made a difference. You would have ended up in the same problem. And I'd cite the fact that BCDC first commissioned the first sea level rise study that made it into planning guidance in 1987. Peter Glick and the Pacific Institute published 1 meter, a map of sea level rise 1 meter, right? In 2009, we did the policy amendment, published a bunch of maps, kind of the same thing, just using GIS. Then Dan Cahan, who's actually the lead PI of the California Nevada RISA, did create through the California climate assessment, the scenarios for that assessment, and that were adopted in state level guidance. I think it was SB 375. And they became the basis for the policy amendment for the Bay Plan. So, you had all these planning level guidance, you know, sort of, you should consider this multiple times over multiple decades. But it was never really, even the Bay Plan Amendment was open to interpretation for any planner or permit analyst who would get a permit. So I know, because I actually got I had to make a recommendation to the commission on whether or not the Sheraton near SFO should be able to expand its parking lot, even though it was getting into an area that was even more, becoming increasingly flood prone. So, but there was never any argument. But in this case, the mayor said, I want this. And you guys had an actionable charge from the beginning. So to me, it's not necessarily the fact that you took all the right steps to get really good climate service steps to get really good information into there is awesome. But had you not had a charge from the mayor to begin with, I don't know that, would it have been the same?
It definitely would not have been the same. We wouldn't have been doing what we did. We wouldn't have had to produce this thing to talk to engineers and planners. And there's another whole story that comes after this, which I don't have time to get into, but this is just step one, really. So we wouldn't have had to do that. The maps that you're referring to, I didn't know you were still there when those came out. So were you at the Waters Utility Climate Change Summit in 2007, at which Travis rolled those maps out? I mean, those maps were public. They were 3 feet. Trav later became famous for saying, just do 3 feet. Don't think about any other number besides 3 feet, which made my blood boil and drove me crazy. And John Englander came around the San Francisco area and saying the same thing. That also drove me crazy. But those were bathtub models, and so was Glick's. And so they exaggerate the impact. And we can't be in the business of exaggerating impact. We have to be in the business of getting it as accurately as we can. And so gradually over time, the modelers moved from bathtub to hydraulic. And in the end, AECOM produced a hydraulic map for us, and they're doing it for everybody else, that really you have to have a water pathway. So that, and you know, there's much more to the story, which is the Sewer System Improvement Program, which is our multi-billion-dollar capital improvement program on the wastewater side, was doing some of this same work at the same time and was funding some of the technical tools that we ended up using to explain to people how to do this stuff. But I don't think I completely agree that the critical moment for us was when Mayor Lee said, go do this. I mean, it was very specific and very targeted, and in the end, this will not be the way policy is managed in San Francisco, because it's an asset-by-asset basis, and you can't do that. You have to do shoreline-wide protection. You can't create islands of resilience for every pump station and every building in the Bay Area. There are some for which you need to do that stuff, and we are doing that, like the fireboat that's right on the pier, right on the water, or the $2.5 billion improvement in the Southeast Treatment Plant that we decided to make resilient to 3 feet immediately, even if, you know, it's not vulnerable for 70 or 80 years, because it's so expensive and so vital to public health. So I think I agree with virtually everything you said. That was my way of agreeing, I guess.
There was like 8 minutes there where I wasn't sure. Okay, John?
I guess 2 related things. One, the capital improvement was a 10-year plan that you served on a commissioner committee, right? And you dug into the science and you came up with what you thought was a good answer, something that was actionable. What's built into the commission, because sea level rise research is a very actively unfolding topic right now. And so let's say 5 years from now, before your 10 years are up, is there a mechanism to reconvene in light of new science?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's like an adaptive management built into the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then the second part is, if you hadn't been on the commission and knew all these climate people, what would have happened? It's kind of like a weak link in the chain if it's dependent on something as important as this for all of the Bay Area, residing on the fact that you knew a bunch of climate people.
That I knew Tad and Phil. That is pretty much accurate, yeah. I mean, on the committee, there were 13 people on the committee, and really the best role of the committee was to get 6 or 7 departments up to speed on climate change. They knew nothing about it heading in. And that's what happened. And I also had Chris May, who's at AECOM, who's a consultant working on the Sewer System Improvement Program, and she and I did the lion's share of the work. She produced the tools and the adaptation approaches, and I focused on the science. But you're right. I mean, my lesson is climate services work even on an ad hoc basis, because you can understand impenetrable reports by entities like NRC, who, by the way, was asked to do their report by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So how they produce something unintelligible when the governator is the one who asked for it, I never really understood. There's probably several stories to that. And the projections, which are by far of the most value to decision makers in my mind, which is the 3 feet, which is the kind of the default number now, were barely intelligible in that document, though they're there. The second part of your question is, yes, we have to revisit this, and it's explained in here. And right now what we're fighting about, Susie and I just had a conversation about this, is the latest, greatest research on West Antarctic, going back 125,000 years, is that it's 250 centimeters, not 140 or 165 centimeters. Now, one of the things I meant to say, but it's in my notes, but I forgot to say it, is one thing that decision makers don't need is cutting edge science. And so we had to differentiate in our process, and I had to continuously pump Tad and Phil and Dan and everyone else to differentiate between kind of workmanlike, old school, not old school, but science that's been around the block a few times and is not, if not consensus, that at least widely accepted, versus the latest, greatest study that comes out. So when Joffin and Rijnaud came out with their West Antarctic ice shelf data, I get calls and emails from every engineer and every manager who knew about our process saying, look, this is something new and different, and you have to dive deep into it. And this is, again, where a climate service dynamic came in handy, because I'd call up Tad or I'd call up Phil and said, what about this? Is this a 2100 thing or is this a 2600 thing? Because 2600 is not an adaptation timescale, obviously. And the answer generally came back, this is a 2600 thing, so if you get 1 more millimeter, and there was actually an Atlantic article that really did a really good job of explaining that. And so that's where the iteration has to come in. The science of sea level rise is moving very rapidly. We need to stay abreast of it. It's not our job. It's not our area of expertise to do the science. It's to understand what comes out and how it fits into our context or doesn't.